There are some wounds that never heal, some losses so profound that they become part of who you are, carried silently for decades until the weight of them becomes almost unbearable. What happened when 80-year-old William "Bill" Patterson walked onto the Family Feud stage with his grandson's family, moving slowly with a cane, wearing a faded Vietnam veteran's cap and a jacket covered in unit patches, was the unlocking of a story he'd kept buried for 53 years, a story about heroism and loss and guilt, and a medal that represented both the best and worst moment of his life. He stood there with kind eyes that had seen too much, hands that trembled slightly, not from age but from the weight of memory, and when Steve Harvey asked him a simple question about his proudest moment, Bill would begin to tell a story so powerful, so heartbreaking, so heavy with sacrifice that it would reduce the entire studio to tears, including Steve Harvey, who would have to stop the show multiple times because he couldn't speak through his sobbing. If you've ever carried a secret so painful that speaking it out loud feels like it might destroy you, if you've ever lost something that represented the most important moment of your life, if you've ever wondered whether you deserved the honors you received, you need to hear what this 80-year-old veteran finally shared after more than 5 decades of silence. Before we begin, if you believe that some stories need to be told no matter how much they hurt, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel, because we share stories about people who carried impossible burdens and finally found the courage to put them down. William Patterson was born in 1944 in a small farming town in Iowa, the youngest of 4 brothers in a family that had served in every American war since the Civil War. His great-grandfather had fought at Gettysburg, his grandfather in World War I, his father had stormed Omaha Beach on D-Day. Military service wasn't just tradition in the Patterson family. It was identity, it was duty, it was what Patterson men did. Bill grew up hearing war stories, learning to shoot before he learned to drive, understanding that when his time came, he would serve like all the Patterson men before him. He was 17 when he graduated high school in 1962, and he enlisted in the Army immediately, following his 3 older brothers who were already serving. By 1965, at age 21, Bill was in Vietnam, a young sergeant leading a platoon in the Central Highlands, fighting a war that was becoming increasingly brutal and complex. He was good at it, being a soldier, leading men, making split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. His men trusted him, followed him into situations that should have killed them, but somehow didn't because Bill Patterson had instincts, experience beyond his years, and a commitment to bringing his men home alive. On November 17, 1967, Bill's platoon was on patrol near the village of Dak Tu, in a region that had seen heavy fighting for weeks. They were moving through dense jungle when they were ambushed by a much larger North Vietnamese force, probably a full company, over 100 enemy soldiers surrounding Bill's platoon of 30 men. The firefight was immediate and intense. Bullets tearing through the jungle, men falling, screaming, the chaos of combat where everything happens too fast and too slow simultaneously. Bill's platoon was pinned down, taking casualties, in danger of being completely overrun. Bill called for air support, but was told it would be 20 minutes, which might as well have been forever in a firefight. He had wounded men who needed evacuation, he had soldiers running out of ammunition, and he had an enemy force that was maneuvering to surround them completely. Bill made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He took 4 men with him, the youngest soldiers in his platoon, kids barely 19 years old, and he led a flanking assault on the enemy position. The idea was to create enough confusion and disruption to break the ambush, to give the rest of the platoon time to fall back to a more defensible position and wait for air support. It was a desperate move, the kind of thing you do when all your other options are worse. Bill and his 4 men moved through the jungle, using the terrain for cover, getting as close as they could to the enemy position. When they were within throwing distance, Bill gave the signal, and they threw grenades and opened fire, charging the enemy position with everything they had. The plan worked, sort of. The enemy was disrupted, confused by the attack from an unexpected direction, and the main body of Bill's platoon was able to fall back. But Bill and his 4 men were now completely exposed, caught in the open, taking fire from multiple directions. One of the young soldiers, a private named Tommy Chen from San Francisco, was hit immediately, going down hard, screaming for help. Bill ran to him, grabbed him by his gear, started dragging him back toward cover. Another soldier, 19-year-old Danny Rodriguez from Texas, came to help, and between the two of them they got Tommy to partial cover behind a fallen tree. But Tommy was hit bad, chest wounds, bleeding out fast, crying for his mother, terrified. Bill tried to stop the bleeding, but there was too many wounds, and Tommy was dying right there in his arms. The other 3 soldiers were laying down covering fire, trying to keep the enemy from advancing, but ammunition was running low and the situation was desperate. Bill made another decision, one that would haunt him forever. He told Rodriguez to stay with Tommy, to keep him comfortable, while Bill and the other 2 soldiers would try to draw the enemy fire away, to give the medevac helicopter that was finally incoming a chance to land and get Tommy out. Rodriguez begged Bill not to leave him alone, said they should all fall back together, but Bill said someone had to stay with Tommy, couldn't leave a wounded man alone, couldn't let him die thinking he'd been abandoned. So Rodriguez stayed, holding Tommy's hand, talking to him, trying to keep him calm while Tommy died. Bill and the other 2 soldiers, privates named Marcus Johnson from Detroit and Kevin O'Brien from Boston, ran toward the enemy position again, firing, throwing their last grenades, making as much noise as possible to draw attention away from Rodriguez and the dying Tommy. It worked. The enemy focused on Bill and his 2 men, unleashing everything they had at them. Marcus was hit first, killed instantly by a burst of automatic fire. Kevin was hit next, wounded but still alive, falling behind a rock outcropping and calling for Bill to help him. Bill was hit too, a round that went through his left shoulder, another that grazed his head, but he was still mobile, still fighting. He got to Kevin, started dragging him backward toward where they'd left Rodriguez and Tommy. Behind them, he could hear the helicopter coming in, could hear Rodriguez screaming for them to hurry, that Tommy had stopped breathing. Bill got Kevin to partial cover, then ran the last 20 meters to where Rodriguez was crouched over Tommy's body, the young man's eyes open and empty, dead. Rodriguez was sobbing, covered in Tommy's blood, and Bill grabbed him and Kevin and they started moving, half running, half crawling toward the landing zone where the medevac helicopter was hovering. The pilot was taking fire, couldn't land, but was holding position long enough for them to get the wounded on board. They were 10 meters from the helicopter when it happened. Another burst of fire from the tree line, rounds hitting all around them. Rodriguez was hit in the back, went down hard. Bill grabbed him, tried to drag both Rodriguez and the wounded Kevin toward the helicopter at the same time. The helicopter crew chief was screaming at them to hurry, the pilot saying they had to leave in 10 seconds or they'd all die. Bill got Kevin to the helicopter, the crew chief pulling him aboard. Then Bill went back for Rodriguez, grabbed him under the arms, started dragging him. Rodriguez was conscious, screaming in pain, and he grabbed Bill's jacket, pulled him close, and said something Bill would never forget. "Sir, leave me. Get out of here. Tell my mom I wasn't scared." Bill said, "I'm not leaving you," and kept dragging, but they were taking too much fire, and Rodriguez was hit again, and Bill knew with absolute certainty that Rodriguez was dead, that he was dragging a corpse, but he couldn't leave him, couldn't abandon one of his men even if that man was gone. The crew chief was screaming at Bill to get on the helicopter. They were leaving in 3 seconds with or without him, and Bill made the hardest choice of his life. He let go of Rodriguez's body, ran to the helicopter, and jumped on as it lifted off. As they gained altitude, Bill looked down and saw Rodriguez's body lying in the clearing, saw Marcus Johnson's body near the tree line, saw Tommy Chen's body where they'd left him, and he saw something else. His jacket, the one Rodriguez had grabbed when he'd pulled Bill close, had been torn off in the struggle. And attached to that jacket was everything Bill carried, his identification, his personal items, and the Medal of Honor he'd been awarded 3 months earlier for actions in a different battle, a medal he wore on his uniform every day as required by regulations, a medal that represented the single proudest moment of his life when he'd saved 12 men from a burning armored vehicle. The medal was lying on the ground next to Rodriguez's body, and as the helicopter banked away and the jungle disappeared beneath them, Bill realized he'd lost it. He'd lost the Medal of Honor in the chaos of trying to save his men, left it behind with the bodies of 3 soldiers who died under his command. When they got back to base, when Bill was being treated for his wounds, when the commanders were debriefing him about what happened, he didn't mention the medal. He told them about Marcus and Tommy and Rodriguez, about how brave they'd been, about how they'd died doing their duty. And when someone asked about the Medal of Honor he'd been wearing, Bill said it must have been lost in the firefight, that it didn't matter, that medals didn't matter compared to the men he'd lost. The Army launched an investigation, not because they suspected Bill of anything, but because a Medal of Honor lost in combat is a serious matter, the highest military decoration the nation can award, and losing one required documentation. Bill told them exactly where it had happened, where the medal probably was, but recovering it would have required sending men back into an area still heavy with enemy activity, risking more lives for a piece of metal. The decision was made not to attempt recovery. The medal was declared lost in combat, and the Army cut orders for a replacement medal to be issued to Sergeant William Patterson. But Bill refused the replacement. He told his commanding officer that he didn't deserve a replacement, that he'd lost 3 men trying to save one, that he'd left Rodriguez's body behind, that a man who abandons his soldiers doesn't deserve the Medal of Honor. His commander tried to explain that Bill hadn't abandoned anyone, that he'd done everything humanly possible, that staying would have just added his name to the casualty list, that the medal was his by right, and he could wear a replacement. But Bill was adamant. He didn't want a replacement. He didn't deserve it. The original medal was lying in the jungle next to the bodies of 3 young men who died following his orders, and that's where it should stay. Bill finished his tour in Vietnam in 1968 and came home to Iowa in early 1969. He was 24 years old, a decorated combat veteran, and he was broken in ways that nobody who hadn't been there could understand. He had nightmares about Rodriguez every single night, about leaving his body behind, about the way Rodriguez had looked at him in those final moments and told him to run. He had nightmares about Tommy dying in his arms, about Marcus being cut down by machine gun fire, about all the decisions he'd made that had led to those 3 young men dying. He received letters from their families, from Rodriguez's mother and Tommy's parents and Marcus's wife, thanking him for bringing their sons' bodies home, for honoring them, for being with them when they died. Every letter was like a knife in his heart, because he felt like he'd failed them, like their sons had died because of his decisions, like he didn't deserve their gratitude or respect. Bill never talked about the war, never talked about what happened, never told anyone about the lost Medal of Honor or the circumstances around losing it. He went back to Iowa, got a job working construction, married a local woman named Dorothy in 1971, had 3 children over the next decade. He was a good father, present and loving, but there was a sadness to him that never went away, a weight he carried that his family could see but didn't understand. Dorothy knew he'd been in Vietnam, knew he had nightmares, but Bill wouldn't talk about it, would just say he'd done his job and seen things he couldn't unsee. He wore his Vietnam veteran's cap with pride, attended Memorial Day ceremonies, supported other veterans, but he never claimed the Medal of Honor, never mentioned it, never acknowledged that he'd once been awarded the nation's highest military decoration. Over the decades, Bill's children grew up, had children of their own, and Bill became a grandfather, which brought him more joy than anything since before the war. His oldest grandson, Michael, born in 1996, was particularly close to Bill, fascinated by his grandfather's military service, asking questions that Bill would deflect, wanting to know about the war that Bill wouldn't discuss. Michael found some of Bill's old military records in the attic when he was helping clean it out as a teenager in 2010, documents that mentioned Sergeant William Patterson being awarded the Medal of Honor in 1967, and Michael asked his grandfather about it, excited, thinking this was the coolest thing ever. Bill's reaction shocked Michael. His grandfather, usually so kind and gentle, became angry, told Michael to put the papers back, to never speak about that medal, that it was in the past and didn't matter. Michael was confused and hurt, didn't understand why his grandfather would be ashamed of receiving the Medal of Honor, but he dropped the subject, not wanting to upset his grandfather further. Years passed, and Bill aged, his health declining, his body wearing out. By 2024, at age 80, Bill had survived 2 heart attacks, had arthritis that made walking difficult, had the typical ailments of an old man who'd lived a hard life. His wife Dorothy had died in 2020, and after her death, Bill's depression got worse, the nightmares more frequent. He spent a lot of time alone in the house he'd shared with Dorothy for 50 years, looking at old photos, thinking about his life, about the war, about Rodriguez and Tommy and Marcus, whose faces he could still see as clearly as the day they died. Michael, now 28 and married with a young daughter, visited his grandfather regularly, worried about him, seeing how isolated and sad he'd become. In early 2024, Michael had an idea. His grandfather loved watching Family Feud, watched it every evening religiously, seemed to find comfort in the routine and the laughter. Michael thought maybe getting Bill on the show, giving him something to look forward to, might help pull him out of his depression. He applied on behalf of their family, Bill, Michael, Michael's wife Sarah, Michael's younger sister Jennifer, and her husband. They were selected to tape in May 2024, and when Michael told Bill, his grandfather initially refused, said he was too old, too tired, didn't want to be on television. But Michael persisted, and eventually Bill agreed, mostly because Michael was so enthusiastic and Bill didn't have the energy to keep saying no. On the day of the taping, May 15, 2024, Bill wore his Vietnam veteran's cap and a jacket covered in his unit patches, but no medals, no decorations, nothing that would indicate his actual service record beyond being a Vietnam veteran. They arrived at the studio, Bill moving slowly with his cane, looking every bit his 80 years. The producers were kind, making sure Bill was comfortable, bringing him a chair, being respectful of his age and veteran status. When it was time to tape, Bill walked onto the stage with his family, and Steve Harvey greeted them with warmth and respect, particularly respectful when he saw Bill's cap and realized he was a Vietnam veteran. After introducing the family, Steve turned to Bill specifically. "Sir, I see you're a Vietnam veteran. Thank you for your service. Can you tell us about your time there?" Bill's answer was short, the practiced response he'd been giving for 50 years. "I served. I did my job. That's all." But Steve, sensing there was more to the story, pressed gently. "Was there a particular moment you're proud of? Something you'd want your family to remember?" This was the question Bill had been dreading and simultaneously waiting for 53 years. He looked at Michael, at his grandson who'd grown up without ever really knowing who his grandfather had been, what he'd done, what he carried. He looked at his granddaughter Jennifer, at his great-granddaughter in the audience, at all these people who would continue the Patterson family legacy of service. And Bill made a decision that terrified him, but that he knew in his bones was the right one. He needed to tell the truth. He needed to stop carrying this alone. "Steve," Bill said, his voice quiet but steady, "I need to tell you something. In 1967, I was awarded the Medal of Honor for actions in combat. I was 23 years old, a sergeant, and I saved 12 men from a burning armored vehicle while under fire. It was the proudest moment of my life receiving that medal, knowing I'd done something that mattered. But 2 months later, I lost that medal. Not lost like misplaced, but lost in combat, in a firefight where 3 of my men were killed." The studio went completely silent. Steve Harvey's face showed immediate shock and concern. Michael gasped, not knowing any of this, staring at his grandfather in disbelief. Bill continued, tears starting to run down his weathered face, his voice shaking but determined to finish the story he'd kept buried for 53 years. "We were ambushed, outnumbered, taking casualties. I took 4 young men with me to try to break the ambush, to save the rest of the platoon. 3 of them died. Private Tommy Chen, 19 years old, died in my arms from chest wounds. Private Marcus Johnson, 20 years old, was killed by machine gun fire trying to cover our retreat, and Private Danny Rodriguez, 19 years old, died calling for his mother while I was trying to get him to a medevac helicopter." Bill's voice broke completely, and he had to stop, sobbing, decades of grief pouring out. The audience was crying, Steve Harvey had tears running down his face, and Michael had moved to his grandfather's side. putting his arm around him. Bill collected himself enough to continue. In the chaos of trying to save Rodriguez, my jacket was torn off, and attached to that jacket was the Medal of Honor I'd been wearing on my uniform. I left it behind, lying in the jungle next to Rodriguez's body. The army offered me a replacement medal, but I refused it. I told them I didn't deserve it, that a man who loses 3 soldiers doesn't deserve to wear the Medal of Honor. I've carried the guilt of that day for 53 years. I've never told anyone the full story, not my wife, not my children, not my grandchildren. I've let everyone think I was just a regular soldier, because the man who earned that medal died the same day I lost it. Steve Harvey was crying openly now, and he had to take several moments to compose himself before he could speak. When he finally did, his voice was thick with emotion. "Mr. Patterson, I need to tell you something. The Medal of Honor isn't something you lose. It's something you earned through actions that saved 12 lives. And what happened later, those 3 young men who died, that doesn't take away what you did to earn that medal. It's not about being perfect. It's about being brave when everything is chaos, about making impossible decisions under fire, about putting other people's lives ahead of your own safety." But Bill shook his head. "You don't understand. I left Rodriguez's body behind. He was dying, and he told me to leave him, to save myself, and I did. I let go of him and got on that helicopter and left him lying there. What kind of man does that? What kind of man abandons his soldier?" Steve's response was immediate and forceful. A man who wanted to live, a man who made an impossible choice in an impossible situation. A man who would have died too if he'd stayed, and then there would have been 4 bodies instead of 3. "Mr. Patterson, you didn't abandon anyone. You survived, and you've been punishing yourself for surviving for 53 years. The weight of Steve's words hung in the air, and Bill looked at him with eyes that held decades of pain and guilt and grief. "But I lost the medal. The actual physical medal is still there, in the jungle, with their bodies." And that's when something extraordinary happened. From the wings of the stage a man appeared, probably in his early 70s, moving with purpose toward Bill. He was Vietnamese, dressed in a simple suit, carrying a small box. Bill looked at him in confusion, not understanding who this was or why he was approaching. The man stopped in front of Bill, and when he spoke, his English was accented but clear. "Sergeant Patterson, my name is Nguyen Van Thanh. In 1967, I was a young man living near Dak 2. After the battle where you lost your men, after the American helicopters left, I went to the battlefield. I was scavenging, looking for anything useful, anything that could help my family survive. I found the bodies of 3 American soldiers, and I found this." He opened the box he was carrying, and inside, tarnished and dirty but unmistakable, was a Medal of Honor. Bill's hand went to his mouth, his entire body shaking. Nguyen continued, "I didn't know what this medal was, not then. I was just a farmer. But I could tell it was important, that it was valuable not for money but for meaning. I kept it for many years, not knowing whose it was or how to return it. Then, 30 years later, in 1997, I immigrated to America with my family. I started learning about American military history, about the war, about the decorations American soldiers received. And I learned that this medal, the Medal of Honor, was the highest honor your nation could give. I knew that whoever had lost this, they deserved to have it back." He paused, looking at Bill with compassion. "I spent years trying to find the owner, working with veteran organizations, trying to match the location where I found it to American military records. It was difficult because I didn't know the name, didn't know the date exactly, only knew approximately where the battle had happened. But I never gave up, and then I saw that your family was going to be on this show. I saw the name William Patterson, and when I contacted the veteran organizations I'd been working with, they confirmed that a Sergeant William Patterson had reported losing his Medal of Honor in that area on that date. So I contacted the show's producers, and they arranged for me to be here today." Nguyen held out the box to Bill. "Sergeant Patterson, this medal belongs to you. It has been waiting 53 years to come home. Please take it." Bill was sobbing uncontrollably, unable to reach for the medal, overwhelmed by the impossibility of what was happening. Steve Harvey had fallen to his knees on the stage, his hands over his face, unable to stand, unable to speak. The entire audience was crying, the crew was crying, and Michael was holding his grandfather who looked like he might collapse from the emotional weight of this moment. Nguyen gently took the medal from the box and pinned it to Bill's jacket, right over his heart where it had been 53 years ago. Your soldiers, they would want you to wear this. They would want you to honor what you did, to remember the 12 men you saved, not just the 3 you lost. Bill looked down at the medal on his chest, this piece of metal that represented both the best and worst of his life, and something broke open in him that had been locked away for more than 5 decades. He reached out and hugged Nguyen, this former enemy who had become the person who returned what Bill thought was lost forever, and they stood there crying together, 2 old men who'd been on opposite sides of a war, but who shared the universal language of loss and honor and the need for healing. Steve Harvey finally managed to get to his feet, though he was still crying, and he spoke to the audience through his tears. I need everyone to understand what just happened. This man, Sergeant William Patterson, earned the Medal of Honor at age 23 for saving 12 lives. Then he lost that medal while trying to save more lives, and he's carried the guilt of that day for 53 years. He refused a replacement medal because he didn't think he deserved it, because 3 young men died under his command and he couldn't save them. And this man, Nguyen Van Thanh, found that medal 53 years ago as a young farmer in Vietnam, kept it safe, brought it to America, spent decades searching for the owner, and today he returned it. Steve's voice was shaking with emotion. This is what honor looks like. This is what duty looks like. Not just Sergeant Patterson's duty to his men, but Nguyen's duty to return what wasn't his, to make sure this medal came home. These 2 men, who were enemies in war, are standing here together in peace, sharing a moment of healing that's been 53 years in the making. He turned to Bill directly. Sergeant Patterson, you said you didn't deserve this medal because you lost 3 men. But you saved 12 men the day you earned it, and the day you lost it, you saved the rest of your platoon by drawing enemy fire away from them. Those 3 men who died, they were heroes. And they died doing what you trained them to do, what they volunteered to do, what every soldier knows might be required of them. Their deaths don't diminish your heroism. They're part of the same story, the story of men who put themselves in danger to protect each other. That's what this medal represents, not perfection but courage. Not never losing anyone, but always trying to save everyone you can. Bill finally found his voice, though it was broken and raw. But I left Rodriguez's body. I let go of him and got on that helicopter without him. Steve's response was gentle but firm. Because the crew chief was screaming that they had to leave or everyone would die. Because Rodriguez was already gone and you were still alive. Because choosing to die with him wouldn't have honored him, it would have just added another body to the casualty count, another family receiving a folded flag. You made the right choice, even though it was the hardest choice. You survived, and you need to forgive yourself for surviving. The words hung in the air, and Bill looked at Steve, at Michael, at Nguyen still standing beside him, at the medal now pinned to his chest, and maybe for the first time in 53 years, he allowed himself to consider that maybe, possibly, he hadn't failed. Maybe surviving wasn't betrayal. Maybe honoring the medal didn't dishonor the men he'd lost. Maybe he could carry both, the pride and the grief, the honor and the loss, without letting the grief destroy the honor. The show didn't continue that day. There was no game, no points, no winner or loser. The producers made the decision that this moment transcended Family Feud, that some stories are more important than entertainment. Instead, Steve spent the next hour talking with Bill and Nguyen, hearing more about that day in 1967, learning about the 3 young men who died, hearing Nguyen's story of finding the medal and his decades-long quest to return it. Michael learned things about his grandfather he'd never known, heard stories that explained so much about the sad, quiet man he'd grown up with, understanding for the first time the weight his grandfather had been carrying. Before they left the studio, Steve arranged for something else. He'd contacted the families of Rodriguez, Chen, and Johnson, the 3 soldiers who died that day in 1967, and he'd invited them to connect with Bill if they wanted to. He explained what had happened, how Bill had been carrying guilt about their deaths for 53 years, how he'd refused to wear his Medal of Honor because he felt he'd failed their sons. The responses came within hours. Rodriguez's younger sister, now in her 70s, wrote to Bill saying that her brother's body had been returned, that he'd been buried with honors, and that her family had always been grateful to Bill for trying to save Danny, for not leaving him alone when he died, for bringing him home. Chen's nephew, Tommy's brother's son, wrote that his family had known about Bill's actions that day, that they'd always considered Bill a hero for staying with Tommy, for trying to stop the bleeding, for holding him while he died so he wasn't alone. Johnson's widow, now remarried but still carrying Marcus's memory, wrote that she'd named her son Marcus Jr. and had told him about Bill Patterson, the sergeant who'd tried to save his father, who'd led them into battle with courage, who'd made impossible choices in an impossible situation. She said that she'd never blamed Bill, that she'd always hoped he was okay, that she'd worried about him carrying guilt he shouldn't carry. These letters, shared with Bill after the taping, broke something in him that needed to break, some wall he'd built around his grief that had kept him isolated for decades. He cried reading them, finally allowing himself to feel not just the guilt, but also the love, the gratitude, the understanding that the families of the men he'd lost didn't blame him, that they honored him for trying, that they saw him as a hero even when he couldn't see himself that way. The episode aired 8 weeks later and became one of the most watched and most shared Family Feud episodes ever. Over 200 million people watched Bill's story, watched the medal being returned, watched Steve Harvey fall to his knees crying. The clip went viral across every platform, with veterans organizations, military families, and people around the world moved by the raw emotion, the profound loss, and the impossible guilt, and the healing that came from facing what Bill had run from for 53 years. The response from the veteran community was overwhelming. Thousands of Vietnam veterans reached out, many sharing their own stories of survivors' guilt, of making impossible choices, of carrying losses that nobody else could understand. Mental health organizations used Bill's story to talk about PTSD and moral injury, about how veterans can carry trauma for decades, about the importance of telling the story, of seeking help, of allowing healing. Then Nguyen Van Thanh became a symbol of reconciliation between former enemies, proof that humanity can transcend the hatred of war, that acts of compassion and honor can bridge divides that seem unbridgeable. He and Bill stayed in touch, became friends. This Vietnamese farmer who'd become an American citizen, and this American sergeant who'd fought in Vietnam, now connected by a medal and a shared commitment to honor and healing. 6 months after the Family Feud appearance, Bill Patterson did something he hadn't done in over 50 years. He attended a Medal of Honor ceremony in Washington, D.C., wearing his medal publicly for the first time since 1967. He met other Medal of Honor recipients, heard their stories, realized that many of them carried similar guilt, similar losses, similar questions about whether they deserved the honor. He learned that heroism doesn't mean being perfect or never losing anyone. It means making hard choices and living with the consequences, carrying the weight of command and the grief of loss while still honoring what you did right alongside what went wrong. At that ceremony, Bill gave a speech that was broadcast nationally. He talked about Rodriguez and Chen and Johnson, about the 3 young men who died under his command, whose names he'd carried silently for 53 years. He talked about the guilt of surviving, about refusing the replacement medal, about spending decades believing he'd failed them. And then he talked about Nguyen, about the Vietnamese farmer who'd kept the medal safe for 53 years, who'd spent decades searching for the owner, who'd given him the gift of reconciliation and healing. "I learned something important," Bill said, his voice steady despite his tears. "You can honor the dead without destroying yourself with guilt. You can remember those you lost without letting their loss define you. You can wear the Medal of Honor while carrying the grief of command, because both are true. I saved 12 men the day I earned this medal, and I lost 3 men trying to save more. Both things happened. Both things matter, and I've spent 53 years thinking the second thing canceled out the first, but it doesn't. They're both part of my story, and I have to honor all of it, not just the parts that hurt." The speech resonated with veterans and civilians alike, becoming a touchstone for discussions about moral injury, survivor's guilt, and the complex realities of combat leadership. Bill lived for 3 more years after his Family Feud appearance, passing away peacefully in his sleep in August 2027 at age 83. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors, wearing his Medal of Honor. At his funeral, hundreds of people attended, including Nguyen Van Thanh, who gave a eulogy about honor and friendship transcending war. Steve Harvey attended the funeral too, and he spoke about the day Bill had walked onto his stage and finally shared the story he'd carried for 53 years. Bill Patterson taught me something I'll never forget. He taught me that carrying guilt for decades doesn't honor the people you lost, it just adds more victims to the tragedy. Those 3 young men who died in 1967. They wouldn't have wanted Bill to spend 53 years destroying himself with guilt. They would have wanted him to live, to be happy, to honor them by living fully. And by finally telling his story, by accepting the medal being returned, by allowing himself to heal, Bill did honor them. He honored them by surviving not just physically but emotionally, by finally forgiving himself for making impossible choices in impossible situations. Michael, Bill's grandson, spoke last at the funeral. He talked about growing up not really knowing his grandfather, seeing only the sad, quiet man who wouldn't talk about the war. And he talked about that day on Family Feud when everything changed, when his grandfather finally opened up, finally shared the burden he'd been carrying alone. My grandfather spent my entire life carrying a secret that was killing him, and the day he finally spoke it out loud, the day that medal was returned to him, I saw him become free for the first time. The last 3 years of his life, he was different. He was lighter. He smiled more. He talked about the war, about his men, about the good and the bad. He finally let us know him, the real him, not just the shell he'd been hiding behind. I'm grateful for those 3 years, grateful that he found the courage to tell his story, grateful that he finally let himself be honored for what he'd done instead of only punished for what he couldn't change. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that guilt carried in silence only grows heavier while truth spoken aloud can heal, hit that like button and share this video. Subscribe to our channel because we need more stories like this. Stories about people who carry impossible burdens and finally find the courage to put them down. Stories that remind us that healing is possible even after decades of pain. Stories that show us that forgiveness, especially self-forgiveness, is sometimes the hardest and most important thing we can do. William Patterson earned the Medal of Honor at 23 for saving 12 lives. He lost that medal at 23 while trying to save more lives, and 3 young men died. He carried the guilt of their deaths and the loss of his medal for 53 years, refusing a replacement, believing he'd failed, punishing himself for surviving when they didn't. And when he finally told his story on a Family Feud stage, when a Vietnamese farmer returned the medal he'd kept safe for over 5 decades, when Steve Harvey and an entire studio audience witnessed this moment of profound healing, something sacred happened. A burden was lifted, a secret was spoken, a guilt was acknowledged and then released. Bill Patterson's story reminds us that heroism is complicated, that leadership means carrying losses that never stop hurting, that survivor's guilt is real and valid and debilitating. But it also reminds us that healing is possible, that speaking truth is powerful, that forgiveness, even of yourself, can come even after decades of pain. That's what happened when an 80-year-old veteran finally shared his lost medal story, and an audience cried, witnessing the kind of courage that has nothing to do with combat and everything to do with the strength it takes to finally forgive yourself for being human.